controls, 100% of locked-in patients, 100% of the patients in the minimally conscious state, but not so many patients in the vegetative state. Again, this is the kind of evidence that suggested that some patients in the vegetative state might be at least minimally conscious enough to deserve a different kind of diagnosis, not just vegetative, but at least showing some minimal evidence of consciousness. Now, that's true. The problem with this is that the P3 activity in the evoked potential is kind of ambiguous. And it's ambiguous because you can get it even in response to a subliminal stimulus, okay? A stimulus that the person is not conscious of. So you don't really know what's going on with this. Moreover, the P3, it's occurring 300 milliseconds after the stimulus. It's an automatic response to a certain kind of stimulus. Again, it's not clear that it's the kind of controlled response that you'd really like to see in a patient who was truly conscious. Which raises the question of what, after all, counts as evidence of consciousness. And most people would argue the more voluntary the behavior is, the more voluntary the response, the more you're willing to call it evidence of consciousness. Here's another study. This is by Owen and his associates, these European investigators. Very interesting study of a single case, a woman who suffered a traumatic brain injury after an automobile accident, went into the vegetative state, and then she was, this is an fMRI study where she was asked to discriminate between speech and noise, and then, interestingly, she was able actually to do that, so you get differential response to speech versus noise in these speech processing areas of the brain. And then the patient, while she was in the magnet, was actually asked to engage in voluntary activity. Now remember, these are patients that can't move, okay? So what she was asked to do was to imagine various kinds of things. In one case, she was asked to imagine watching a tennis game, moving her head back and forth or moving her eyes back and forth. When controls are asked to do that, you see a lot of activity in what's known as the supplementary motor area, okay? And you're seeing exactly the same kind of imagery, the same kind of activity in this patient. In another case, the patient was asked to imagine walking around her house. When control patients were asked to do that, you got activations in the primary motor cortex and also in the posterior parietal cortex. And this patient also showed activity in the primary motor cortex and in the posterior parietal cortex. This study, landmark study, was the first to indicate that patients in the minimally conscious state can actually engage in voluntary responses to command. They can't physically move, because they can't physically move. That's the problem with the vegetative state. But they're engaging in brain activity that suggests that they're at least trying to initiate those kinds of movements or to imagine those kinds of movements. There are now a bunch of studies like this. This is the best one so far, very interesting on a bunch of grounds. It's the same group of investigators. First author here is a guy named Monty. 54 patients, okay, 23 of whom were diagnosed in the vegetative state, 31 diagnosed in the minimally the conscious state, being compared to 16 healthy controls. And what they did was basically to do what Owen had done with that single patient with this very large group of patients. This is a European consortium. They're basically going all over Europe looking for these patients, where the patients are asked to imagine hitting a ball on a tennis court, okay, actually engaging in various kinds of motor activity, and also walking down a familiar street or walking around a house. And again, what you see here, these are 5 patients. These are the controls showing their activity. on these imagery tasks, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patients. 5 patients out of 54 showed differential cortical activity in response to these kinds of the commands. Okay. Now, 2 things are interesting about this. 5 out of 54. What's the likelihood of being in the vegetative state in the first place? About 50% 1 month after 1 month after coming out of a coma. Okay, what's the likelihood of doing that? 10%. So we're talking about very, very, very rare instances here. Moreover, interestingly, of these 5 patients, 4 of them had been diagnosed in the persistent vegetative state. Only 1 of them had actually been diagnosed in the minimally conscious state. The fact that more of these patients showed differential responsiveness in the vegetative state than in the minimally conscious state suggests to me, at least, that the clinical criteria for diagnosing the minimally conscious state are not very good. Okay? They're not perfect yet. By any standard, patients in the minimally conscious state should have been more responsive to these kinds of instructions than patients in the vegetative state. But in fact, the vegetative patients were more responsive. But the important thing is you could use these techniques to get evidence that at least some of these patients, apparently comatose, apparently vegetative, maybe minimally conscious, are in fact conscious in the sense that they're able to differentially, voluntarily respond, at least as measured by brain activity, to various kinds of commands. Yeah? Yeah, we know that exactly. Okay, so I did that here. There were 23 PVS patients, 31 MCS patients. Okay, so 4 of the 23 PVS patients, that's 17%, versus only 1 of the 31 minimally conscious patients, that's only 3%. So, again, you'd expect those numbers to be turned around. Okay, so the diagnosis of minimally conscious state, not perfect yet, but you can kind of see what the possibilities are here for using brain imaging technology to find out whether somebody is at least minimally conscious, despite the fact that by virtue of their brain damage, they're not able to communicate with us in any other way. Exactly what we do with this information, that's a problem for medical ethics, okay? That's a problem for families and for patients themselves. But at least here, by using converging operations, we're able to determine that a patient who doesn't appear to be conscious is, in fact, conscious. It's rare, but it occurs. Next time, we'll talk about surgical anesthesia, and we'll ask the same kinds of questions. Thank you.